All right, welcome back to episode 41 of Miles Better. It's been a little while, but we are happy to be here. How are you going, Josh?
Yeah, I'm going well. It has been far too long since our last episode, but my training has been improving and I'm excited for our new podcast format.
And how's the shape? I mean, 228 was the peak for you back in 2018.
2018, yeah. The shape now is, I'm improving. I'm in about 250 shape at the moment and just about on track for a good time in Berlin. We'll see whether I can make every day count between now and then. But that's to be seen in the next 2 months, really.
Well, we've got a pretty, I think, packed schedule for the next few months. We wanted to take a bit of time before properly relaunching into the podcast because we've got a concept that we'll be starting with that is, I think, quite different to anything else I've seen in the world of podcasts. It's not the run-of-the-mill, how you going, here's what's happening in the running world, and perhaps the odd elite athlete interview. We'll be going a lot deeper. So we'll be effectively doing an athlete series where we dive into people's training. They may be elite athletes. They may be, creators of some description that are, committed to getting better. They might be regular people like you and I who are also committed to getting better. And what we'll be doing is, through a very data-led lens, looking at the training that unlocked their personal bests and perhaps comparing it to a previous race prior to that breakthrough. So what we want to do by that is to really shine a light on what are the drivers of performance for most of us. And I mean, you won't be surprised to hear that there's not that much of a difference in the drivers of performance between someone running a 3:30 or 4-hour marathon and someone running a 2:10 marathon. So the whole purpose of that is really pull back the curtain on people's training and understand what leads to some of these breakthroughs. And Josh, anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's also going to pull back the curtain on kind of how kaizen works to a certain extent, right? Because we'll be viewing this through a kaizen lens, sometimes digging into the specifics of an individual run session or week if someone thinks that that was a crucial moment for them in training. But it's all going to be framed through that usual kaizen lens of kind of training load and the specifics not mattering too much. So hopefully it's going to be a really interesting angle. And I'm keen to get started with some of your better performances, right, Michael?
So what we'll be doing to kick this off is, as we refine the concept, we're the guinea pigs. So I'm up first, and Josh, you'll be episode number 2 or 42 in the overall canon of our podcast history. And then from then on, we'll have a number of guests on each week. And so whilst we're able to look into their data, the source of truth, what we'll aim to do is then get the qualitative input, the personal lived experience around how things felt and what their perceptions were of what may have changed between block A and block B, and make some comparisons between the data and the anecdotal. As runners, obviously, we trick ourselves into thinking some things are more important than they might be. And so this is an opportunity to go deep on that.
Absolutely. But before we start with the new podcast, I think that, or the new format, I think that it might be worth just touching on some of the new features that have landed in the app recently. Maybe it's time to give it a go if you, the listener, haven't used Kaizen in a while, because there's been a whole suite of new features. Michael, do you think you can name them all off the top of your head? What are the last month's new features?
Look, the one I'd start with, because it is July now, people are starting to think about autumn marathons. And I mean, this is the one that I've wanted for a very long time, which is, as you embark on a block, you kind of want to know how much training you're going to need to do in order to be in a certain shape by a certain day. Kaizen does that for you already in the background, but what it didn't do was tell you up front, if you do X training, where does that leave you in terms of shape? And what sort of time commitment is that on a week-to-week basis, so that you can understand, given everything else going on in your life, if that is a responsible target to aim for, if you need to be more conservative with that, given work, family, kids, etc. Particularly for those with kids in the Northern Hemisphere, autumn marathon training falls in the holiday period. So, that means school, daycare, etc. is off. And I know for me that impacts my ability to train and I have to change some things. So we've built a training simulator that lets you plug in the training you think you can do. And based on that training, we'll spit out a marathon, or actually any race distance prediction for you based on those training variables. So obviously that's relative to you based on your past performances and training. So it's the most, I guess, personalized version of this that you will find anywhere in being able to really pinpoint the investment you're going to need to make across a 10-week block, but some of the weeks are weighted more than others. So, a good rule of thumb to think about it is probably for the 2.5 months leading to a race, what do I need to average? Also knowing that if, the first few weeks you're still ramping up, it's going to count a little bit less, and the last week or two also probably won't count as much either.
Which is actually a new feature. So Kaizen back in the day, used to use a linear averaging system, and now we use a weighted averaging system. So actually you've listed two new features there, and this weighted average is something that I'm quite pleased with. It gives two things: slightly better, more accurate predictions, because of course across a 2-month training block, the runs right at the tail end of that 2-month period probably contribute to your fitness a little bit less than the ones that happened maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks ago. So weighting the relevance of those runs in our analysis allows for both a more accurate prediction and just a smoother experience when you're using the app, because previously we had this, and many Kaizen users will have experienced this, where a particularly strong or particularly weekday kind of falls off the back of that analysis window, and all of a sudden your prediction, despite you not doing any running yet today, maybe jumps or falls by an unexpected amount. And that artifact has been removed because we taper off the impact of these runs. So that weighting is actually something you might not immediately see when you open up the app, but something that makes the model better and nicer to use. I was actually just having a little play with the training calculator myself to look at what a PB might look like for me, and I'm seeing that with the most appropriate tailoring for me, about 140 Ks a week at a pace I think I can sustain. So that'll be my target for the next 2 or 3 months.
Where does that get you?
That gets me to low 227.
Really? That's pretty good.
Yeah, well, that's quite optimistic tailoring. That takes into account the carbon shoes and probably better fueling than I have done in the past. And yeah, really, that's really a premium race day. So I would hope to get a few extra Ks in or go a bit faster in order to have a bit more buffer. But I think it's doable.
Yeah, I can't remember specifically where I landed, but I think it was telling me something similar. But that's just to get to like a 234 or something like that.
Yeah.
I think
And let
maybe
me just whiz through maybe a few of the other new features before we dive into the podcast main content. It's super exciting now that you can, within the app, plan cross training, and we've introduced workouts as well. So you can in edit mode, and within this new system that we're releasing called Build Your Own Training System, which sits alongside the existing one long, one hard, and even spread and blank canvas. You can add workouts and pick from a vault of Kaizen suggested workouts, or have Kaizen select an appropriate workout for you for that day and for your fitness and for your running goals. So I've been super pleased to see this. It allows for a whole range more approaches to training, because now Kaizen is saying, okay, if you do this workout, we'll model what impact that specific workout has on your fitness and what impact that will have on your donut. So it takes away a huge amount of guessing for people who were using Kaizen but also doing workouts which we previously didn't factor into that donut. It factors them in and allows for training systems built around workouts. So that's really exciting.
Yeah, and worth, I guess, focusing a bit more on the cross training as well. So you can plan cross training activities now, which allows you to have confidence in then how much you need to run, because the more cross training you do, the more of a haircut you get on the running that needs to happen for that week. So this just gives you a bit of certainty around what that actually looks like.
Yeah, and a haircut is the way to put it, right? Cross training isn't having a phenomenally huge impact on your running performance, but it's factored in and it's accounted for in that donut. What else have we got? I would say we're going to go quick fire with these new features now because there's so many of them, and I'm interested to get in deep dive into your data, Michael. We've also got this new heart rate score. So alongside your predictions graph and your training weeks graph, you'll see a new graph called heart rate efficiency, which describes a metric that I'm very familiar with. I love. It's called heartbeats per kilometer. So we're assessing here how many heartbeats it costs you to run a kilometer, or miles if you're using imperial units. What we're doing there is we're kind of saying, well, because of course your heart beats faster as your running speed increases and you work harder, it kind of is a way of equalizing that and saying we're not just looking at what your heart rate is when you're running, but we're seeing how strong and efficient your heart rate is, how far each heartbeat is moving you. So a lower beats per kilometer score implies a stronger, more efficient cardiovascular system and improved race performance. The caveat I would add with this feature is that it does rely on good heart rate data. So if you're not wearing a reliable heart rate monitor, the graph might look pretty wonky. And additionally, it's also affected quite heavily by hydration status, heat, things like that. How often you pause your watch on your runs, because of course you'll get an artificially low heart rate if you're consistently pausing your watch, traffic lights, things like that. So there are some few asterisks. I'd call this an advanced feature within the app, but for the users who wear reliable heart rate monitors and know what they're doing with it, it's a really interesting graph. And in a best case, it matches up with your progress graph really nicely. As your predictions improve, your efficiency improves. It's wonderful.
I mean, the other thing is, speaking of graphs, we've now got a toggle on the week graphs. So not only can you see your, weekly distance that you're achieving, but you can also then toggle that to a training load view so that you understand that relationship between, the mileage that you're doing relative to the training load. So obviously if that's at a higher intensity or there's more cross training minutes or whatever else, the training load will be higher than it is on, an equal distance week that doesn't have those similar attributes.
Yeah, absolutely. And that new toggle is a great way to kind of get a feel for that comparison. It can sometimes be pretty surprising. Even after all these years, I toggle that and I'm sometimes surprised, maybe only 15 kilometers at a faster pace might be a higher training load than, say, like even 40 kilometers at a slower pace. So sometimes I'm surprised by how the relationship between intensity and distance ends up falling. But that's how the maths falls. And it can be really interesting to see that visualization. Now, there's a few more new features, but I'm going to suggest we save them for next episode and get right into that data, Michael. How does that sound?
I think
Wonderful.
the whole build your own training system will require its own sort of thing.
We'll go into that detail next time. But for now, remind us, what is your PB and when did you achieve it?
I ran 2:37.08 in Berlin 2023, and I negative split that race. So that's what we'll deep dive on. So why don't I start with my recollections of the race? I recall, I think, being in around 234, 235 kaizen shape, but I was really sick the week leading up to the race from memory. Negative split the race and very much enjoyed myself. That was on the back of running 2:38.30 something, I think, in Hamburg, where we went together. You ran pretty well that day, I think 2:32 or something. And I had run the Hamburg race quite poorly. So I did the opposite to what I did in Berlin, basically. Like I went out at 2:36 flat pace and then paid for it in the second half. Whereas in Berlin, I sort of did the inverse. And I think the reason for that was because I was sick in the week leading up to Berlin. So I had like a pretty bad chest infection. And, if any runners are out there familiar with the notion of as long as it's above the shoulders, you'll be fine. Well, I was very much below the shoulders and not fine and a bit concerned. But I did zero running until like the Friday of that week. So it was what we'd call a very aggressive taper. And on that basis, I just sort of said, I'm going to sandbag it a little bit based on where I think my fitness is and try and enjoy myself. So I was more conservative than I otherwise would have been. And other things that I think contributed to the result. So what we'll do is we'll look at that race and the build up leading up to it, as well as the Hamburg race earlier in the year. And the thing to bear in mind here is that I was on gardening leave throughout this period. So for me, it meant a bit more flexibility in being able to train and commit to training. So I was definitely training over 10 hours a week, which is pretty hard to do when you've got a job and kid. And so from memory, I think the blocks were sort of similar in terms of overall training and where my fitness was.
And I can provide some insight on whether your memory is correct, and phenomenally similar. So similar that I've got the two blocks here side by side in front of me, and it's pretty difficult to pick them apart. They have, for both races, you were averaging 122, 123 kilometers a week at an average pace of 4:48. Within 1 second a kilometer and 1 kilometer per week average stats, you were running slightly more training elevation going Berlin compared to Hamburg, but only kind of 250 compared to 400. Is it 400? Yeah, 250 compared to 500. So you're running about double the elevation going into Berlin, but it doesn't affect your prediction that much. Your prediction is pretty similar for both. So yes, you're do continue, but you're right that the blocks were very similar.
So I was in a similar shape, and I think the way the difference was how I executed the races. There might have also been so Hamburg went out too hot, struggled coming home, and had like a hamstring sort of a niggle that had flared up in the weeks preceding. So just really struggled to bring it home. I can't remember what my splits were, but it was definitely a positive split, probably like 2.5 minutes or something. And there were I'm not sure how well I fueled. I can't really remember. Can't remember if there were bottles on courses or not. But I know we did a good carb load because I was with you, and we ate a lot of donuts in the hotel room. I would have had a lot of gels, but I specifically remember at halfway feeling really good in Hamburg and pushing on a little bit too. Like there was a really, yeah.
Your memory's correct. Your memory's correct.
There was an amazing pack of like 15 people going through like, I don't know what the pace was, maybe 236, 237 pace around there. And at halfway, I was like, I feel good here. And then I pushed on, got caught between packs, and then it got really hard. So I think I put that down to two things. One is me having a head full of steam and thinking, A, I was in better shape than I was based on how I was feeling. And B, then also not having the benefit of just tucking into a pack and letting other people do most of the work and taking the wind out of the wind resistance out of it. So I think that they were the two primary factors, but primarily the pacing, I would say.
Yeah, let's dig into some of these numbers here, because your memory is pretty correct, and actually there's photo evidence to back up your memory here. I've got some photos from the day. Perhaps we can put them on screen for anyone watching on video podcast, if that's possible. But there is a great photo of you in a pack around halfway, in the middle of this pack, looking really strong. And then a photo of you towards the end of the race by yourself, still looking quite good, but definitely alone on the course. It looks like much harder work in the photo. And the numbers back that up. So your fastest kilometer, I believe, was the 20, or maybe not the entire fastest kilometer, but your fastest few hundred meters were just after halfway, where you were, no, I think it is your fastest kilometer. Kilometer 24 of that race was the fastest kilometer. So, and there are a bunch of kilometers around between about 22 and 25 where you're going, and the margins are really fine here. You average 3:45, and your quickest kilometer was 3:36. So you're not going off too like mega quickly on that kilometer. It's actually a very slightly downhill K as well there. So it's not like you made a crazy stupid decision. You just went a little over the line, I think, rather than stay a bit more sensible, which might have been 4 or 5 seconds a kilometer slower if you had wanted to push it. And you paid for it by doing your last few kilometers over 4 minutes a kilometer. So your memory is absolutely correct. It was not a badly paced race by any stretch of the imagination, but also probably could have been a bigger PB had you run a slightly more sensible race, which you then went and did in Berlin. You look at this Berlin race and your description of the race on Strava tells a very different story, that you just waited an extra 12 kilometers before deciding to go, and it paid dividends with a 1 minute negative split. So you ran 79 minutes and then 78 minutes for the two halves. So a lovely 1 minute negative split. And the photos tell exactly the inverse story, right? We've also got some photos of you here in Berlin, and in the final kilometer in Berlin, there's this amazing photo of you powering away from the pack you're with, leading the pack and kind of having this super strong finish, which you, I think it's fair to say, really didn't have in Hamburg.
Yeah,
So
it's incredible how there's a result that's basically a minute apart, just over a minute apart, and the memories that you have of the race, it's like the two different worlds in a way. Like it's like I ran 2 in Hamburg versus 2:37 in Berlin, with the way that
but
I
you did
remember
almost
it.
exactly the same training. That's the thing that's really amazing about these two training blocks, is that I think unintentionally, right, you weren't attempting to copy your Hamburg block for Berlin. Is that correct?
No, I was just training.
You were just doing your thing and you landed in the same place, and the experience on the day was such a different experience, and you squeezed an extra minute and a half or minute and a half out of the result. So it was both a minute and a half faster, and it was an infinitely more enjoyable day. By, as far as I can tell, the only difference is that you waited an extra
10 Ks to
10
go.
Ks before going. Because debatably, when I look at this Hamburg marathon, if you had done that in Hamburg, you possibly could have avoided this fall off. You really only fell off the pace in the last 5 or 6 K. So it wasn't like you collapsed at 33 kilometers at all. It was like you slowed down by about 15 seconds a kilometer in the last 5K. If you had waited, who knows what Hamburg would have brought had you waited. Do you think, armed with the knowledge that you have now, you would have made a different decision in Hamburg? Or do you just think that it was the way it was and you were feeling so good, you were in such a good pack, you wouldn't have been able to make a better decision?
No, I think I'd be making a different decision now.
Because you're more knowledgeable, or because you think...
Well, I think it's just because I'm more knowledgeable, it's risky to go off the front of a pack that you're in at halfway. Because I know, there's the old saying that halfway of the marathon is about 32 Ks, like from a mental model standpoint, which I think is a reasonable way to look at things. And at the time, I felt so good that, another half marathon at a faster pace in my mind at that point in time felt like a very doable thing. But I think you need to be a little bit more conservative.
It's amazing how badly it can come back to bite you. Let's dig into your training a little bit, if that's all right. So week by week, I'm looking here at your training block leading into Hamburg. Let's start with that. It looks to me to be pretty good, although there's 1 or 2 weeks where it seems like something went on in the Hamburg block where you were running a bit less, particularly the week of March 20th to the 26th. Do you remember why that was not such a good week?
Yeah, I remember I did this 4x5K session, and that's a big session by for anyone really, but especially for me at the time. And my hamstring flared up, and I didn't know what it was, and I couldn't really pinpoint what it was. So I think I took a few days off and then got back to running after that. So where were we? I think that's what it was. I can't say for sure. Oh no, you know what it was? We were in Australia, and then we were traveling back to Europe.
Yeah, so this is interesting. As I look through this block, I see you're in Australia, and things are going pretty well. There's some, like, you've got a 35K run in there in the kind of the 12th of March, 6 by 3K, 29K. God, 1 week you did a 34K run and a 29K run on the same week, and you ended up with 130Ks that week. So, you know, a really good week, but then it seems like when you arrive back into Europe, you struggle to hit the ground running.
No, I think it's just travel. Travel with two kids. It's impossible to keep a big week up.
Mm,
I think that's what it was.
not
Because
that much you can do about
I'm looking at the other weeks, and then I was pretty good at spacing out my training. I wasn't doing the big sessions because I think the hamstring had flared up and I didn't really know what it was. It was like, I thought it was a tendon thing. I think it's actually it ended up plaguing me for years. It was like a nerve thing until I think this time last year, I still had it. Anyway, it's gone now, so that's good. But I think on the back of that, I stopped doing big sessions and just did some shorter, sharper sessions and just a lot of easy running, but more volume, like doing doubles after the kids went to bed and things like that.
Yeah, I'm seeing some lovely long, easy runs in here. And your biggest week was 150K. So it's worth noting that you average 122 kilometers a week in this training block, with a peak week 150K, and your lowest week was right in the middle of that training block at 73K. So some big variation there. It's by no means a perfect training block at all. It's a good training block for sure, but by no means perfect. Scuppered a little bit by the travel on on those 2 weeks towards the end of March.
Mm. Here we go.
Yeah.
I found I did on this is what not to do. I ran 26 Ks one day, just jogged. And then the following day, I did 36 Ks, including 30K steady, averaging 4:11s, 2.5 hours. And I think that was where I flared up my hamstring actually from memory. So, that's just a huge amount of training load split across 2 days, like 56 Ks of running, most of which was at like intensity, like under
Yeah.
4 minute days.
Sounds pretty challenging, to be honest.
And that's like 2 weeks out from the race. Like, I would not recommend doing that. That's cramming at its best.
Yeah, that is. And then you managed to race, and I do remember you complaining about your hamstring while you were in the race, even though you still got a PB.
I was like a dodgy nerve thing, so you can just run through that, right?
Yeah. Okay,
I
let's move on to
remember
Berlin. So I would rate that. What would you give yourself for that training block out of 10? I've got a score in mind. I want to hear you say it
training
first.
block, I think, was maybe an 8, because that was my previous PB was like a year before where I ran 2:42, and this was a clear step up in training load from the previous one. Like there was a big jump in terms of the training that happened relative to the previous marathon. So give it an 8.
You're giving it an 8. I would have said I'd give it a 7. So we're not a million miles off each other there. I think that in January and February, you could have done a bit more running. I see very little running in early February. I know it's hard to motivate yourself in February in Berlin, but I think you would have put yourself in a better position to get the most out of your training block if you had done a bit more in January, February. And possibly, you can never, this is counterfactual stuff, but you can never know, but possibly you would have been in a stronger position to avoid the injury if you had been building on more consistent training through winter.
Yep. I think we were in
Pay
Australia.
for that with an injury that lingered for a few years, and a good training block. But I think it's a 7 out of 10. So an 8 and a 7. Not bad at all. Let's move on to Berlin and think about the training for that. Now, what do you recall from this training cycle?
I was still on gardening leave. I was starting a new job just after Berlin, I remember. So I thought this was my last hurrah. Probably would have been 35, thinking this is the peak of my athletic maturity and I'm not working. So I thought this was a good chance to try and give it a real crack. And what I remember of it is that training was pretty good, punctuated with a couple of weeks in Greece with my sibling and their partner and 2 kids, which makes it super hard to get any consistent training in because obviously it's quite hot. Greek Islands are not really set up to run. I think we were parked in one spot for 2 weeks, but I remember doing runs like there's a run here, midnight fartlek at 11:43 p.m., 15 Ks. You know,
I
like
remember this. I remember this happening, and you kind of saying that everyone else would be going to bed and you'd head out because it was also a very hot place to be running, right? You were post a glass of wine at dinner, heading out for your
something
nighttime
like
run.
that. Anyway, it's not the way to do it. I think
Yeah.
looking at this, most of them are in the morning, but there were definitely a few, 10-mile plus runs happening in the evening after dinner and after bedtime. So look, that was only a couple of weeks. So aside from that, I think it was quite good. And again, I got good at, I guess, dad hours, getting something done in the morning and then going again in the evening to top it up.
I think that this is a better training cycle, just a little bit better, 1 point better than the one leading into Hamburg. You have avoided, you're a bit more consistent week on week. Your biggest week is 150 again, so almost exactly the same biggest week, but there's a bit less variation. Your lowest week is 96. So your the most challenging week for you, which was one where you were on holiday, only managed 96K. That variation, although I might argue that, it possibly doesn't matter that much because in the end you end up with the same training prediction. I think it's a more, at least a more aesthetically pleasing training block because you're a bit more consistent. And if we're not going for aesthetically pleasing, then what are we going for with our training blocks?
Yeah.
And I would add that you had a more consistent block. So before that, 8 to 12 weeks out from the race, you had built up more consistently and nicely through early summer and into kind of June, July. So it put you in a better position to maybe, absorb those bigger weeks.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. This is a reminder I need to get my game on for Berlin this year. If I haven't hit 100K week yet in this training block. So I'm going to have to quick smart. The one big difference the one thing that's changed between how I train now and how I trained then was there was just what I was basically doing then was maybe one shorter session a week and then maybe a longer like marathon-y type workout. But maybe just a marathon type workout and just a lot of easy miles. Whereas now I'm more time constrained and I'm doing 3 sessions a week where I'll be doing like 30 to 40 minutes worth of higher intensity work, like threshold work on a given day, 3 times a week. And yes, so what my aim will be, I think you said I was averaging about 448s for those 2 training blocks. I'll be looking to try and run the similar average mileage on a weekly basis, so somewhere between 120 and 130 leading into this Berlin, but probably around 430s, I'd imagine, on average.
Yeah, so you're going to try something different. I mean, what I would say is it's given that you, between these two training blocks, as I understand it, didn't attempt to replicate the Hamburg block for Berlin, right? You just did the training you were doing, and okay, admittedly, given that you were in a similar situation in your life at the time, those blocks ended up looking somewhat similar. There are definite differences. You did more consistent build and a higher lowest week for Berlin. You had a better pre-block for Berlin, but at the end of the day, they produced two pretty similar training blocks and the abstracted stats. So I'm talking here just raw average speed and raw average, or rather, I mean, weighted raw, but we're not looking at how you performed in any one session or any one run or the length of your longest run or anything like that. You just did sensible training, and then we can look at the training kilometers, training speed, and you end up with very consistent, very similar training blocks and very similar results.
I mean, it's not surprising, really, is it?
No, it's not surprising, but I think it's point proven, right? I would make the case that you pretty much could swap the training block and the race around, and it would be like one of those, like which is your card things, because they're fungible, pretty
Yeah,
much.
well, I mean, it's an interesting point, right? Like, there was also not much. I've never been one to be really rigorous with following a plan. I've never had a coach. I've never set out to be really intentional about my training. And I think where I was with my running in 2023, I thought, look, I've got more time. So I'm going to try and just, in a relatively risk free way, maximize the training I can do, which was basically do as much distance as I can on a week to week basis and increase that mileage and don't get injured. So I think that's why I was doing, maybe one higher intensity session a week, one long run, in some cases, back to back long run into high intensity long run, but I mean, that sort of like makes the point, right? There wasn't that much intention or structure to how I ran for either of these blocks, yet managed to get PBs in both. And had I paced Hamburg better, I probably would have been closer to the mark of where I was in Berlin.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of what I was going to say, right? You're doing pretty similar training. I think you could swap those training blocks around. The difference in the result, you get a minute and a half difference in your result, and between these two blocks, I would suggest that that is pretty much entirely down to execution in terms of being a smarter person, making better decisions in Berlin rather than that decision. It's amazing that minute and a half, that one decision in that one moment in Hamburg costs you a minute and a half, which you then earn back in Berlin. Also interesting to note that we're sitting here talking about this. I would look, if I didn't know the results and I looked at these two training blocks, I would probably rate the Hamburg one as a 7 and the Berlin as like a 8, perhaps. But it turns out that that isn't borne out in the predictions. It's I would argue coincidental that that's borne out in the race, but it's
Yeah,
not borne
right.
out in the predictions.
The difference was execution on the day, but the data actually says I was in better shape for Hamburg.
But only just, right? So
I think I was more aggressive in Hamburg because I felt like I was in better shape, and more conservative in Berlin because I felt like I wasn't in as good a shape as I was for Hamburg, right?
yeah,
But I mean,
100%. And also worth noting that, you were ill before. There's that huge curveball of being ill before Berlin. And it turned out not to matter at all. So maybe that was what you needed, just what you needed for the taper. Maybe that's a takeaway for both of us and listeners, that sometimes something like an illness, maybe even in your taper period, might end up not mattering at all when you look back on it. I mean, of course, it could have been a different story. We're not going to sit here and pretend that an illness in your taper period inherently doesn't matter, but it might not, as was the case for you.
yep. So what would I can tell you exactly if I want to run under 235, which would be my objective now. Because I think it's interesting to look backwards, but I'm also keen to learn from those experiences, both training and racing, to then see how I can, improve for the future. For me, like I said, I've actually got some, I'm not sure if I call it intention, but I have some structure to the way I train. That's driven by how do I get bang for buck in the time that I have. So I want to try and be in a position where I can run 120 Ks a week off 8 hours, not 10. And that's kind of what's dictating my training rather than marathon specificity. So,
Yeah,
what
and
do
look,
you,
when I talk to you, I get the impression that you enjoy that more. So first and foremost, regardless of what this recommendation or this kind of analysis that I'm now going to provide comes within that framework, that I'm not thinking about what I would do in your position, but rather what I think you should do, because knowing who you are and knowing the type of training that you seem to enjoy. And yeah, that's it. I think if you can end up with the same training distance per week, but coming from maybe consistently 2 sessions per week, you're going to have that training speed is going to be faster. Don't care about elevation. It will be what it is, and it doesn't really make much of a difference for you there. Cross training, you didn't do any cross training in either training block, so it's gonna that additional those additional sessions per week are going to push that training speed up and hopefully result in a better performance. It's worth noting, I don't think your training speed needs to be pushed up very much. What do you get if you go to your training simulator in Kaizen, put in 120 kilometers a week, and I mean, of course, you should. I'm assuming here you've tailored your race prediction to these two races and these two races alone.
No, I've done it to 4, but I can change that quickly.
Change it quickly to these two, and then we're going to get you to put in 120 kilometers a week and see, and maybe average the two training elevations. So it's going to be 300 meters a week of training elevation, and then see what speed you need to get a 235 prediction. Because I don't think you're going to need to be running much faster. I think it's going to be, I would guess that if you'd been running about 440, 448, 450, 448 in training, I think it's going to be about 445, 443, something like that.
My last 2 weeks have been 435-ish. So if I run 120 Ks a week, 437s, that gets me just under 235.
What training 300 meters a week of training elevation?
170.
Bump that up to 300 because you will inherently do more elevation, although actually, given where you live, you might not. But bump it up to 300, to 250.
Give me, just under 234 now.
Yeah, so let's see what pair that speed back, see what 230, what speed you have to do to get 235.
440s.
So you really only need to average 8 seconds a kilometer quicker. Now, where is that coming from? Is that coming from your easy pace being 8 seconds a kilometer quicker? That's not what your intention is. Your intention here is to run at the same easy pace and pull that in the right direction with
better sessions or longer sessions. So
time will tell.
Yeah, we'll see. I think, look, if the sessions become harder because they're longer, then the easy pace isn't coming down, because I'm going to need the easy pace to stay pretty easy to recover. Because
in fact, the easy pace might go the other way.
Yeah, well, I'm closer to 40 than I am 35 now, and I find that my legs don't work that well when I first wake up and get out the door. Like, I've started drinking coffee before sessions so that I can wake my body up. Like, it's dire. It's really dire. So I'm also not the same runner.
For a man that doesn't even usually stock coffee in his house, as I learnt, that is quite a change.
Yeah, so exactly. So I can't bank on easy being easy and faster just because I'm fitter anymore. So if I'm making the investment in 3 sessions, it'll be, extending those sessions, not going crazy on the intensity. So I wouldn't be doing any reps that are faster than half marathon pace or effort, really. I would probably sprinkle a bit of that in, shorter reps, just for fun, get the legs moving a bit quicker and just to mix it up and keep it interesting. But then I'll also probably add like slower than marathon pace, longer workouts. And that might be replacing a long run. So I think I just enjoy that more than doing a really slow long run. Because also where I am, it's like 30 degrees and 70% humidity or higher. Gets pretty brutal out there in a long run.
Yeah, it does. And it's tricky to jump into the sea and then carry on running because the salt water's not nice to be running with you. But anyway, also the good news is that you've got precisely the right amount of time. No spare time. You've got absolutely no spare time to faff about and mess this up. But you have all of the time that you need. You've got 10 weeks of training and 1 week of taper. All of this analysis we've been working with is this weighted average happens in the 10 weeks before T-7. So race date, 7 days for taper, 10 weeks before that. It's Tuesday today as we're recording this. So actually you've got 10 weeks minus 1 day, but you ran yesterday?
Yep. Ran this morning.
So you're on track, really. What distance will you aim for this week?
Well, I'd like to get over 110 this week so that I'm at least close. So I don't have to do too much more on the back end.
I think that makes sense. And as we know, just the law of, how maths works is that having a single week where you mess up and let that distance drop, or rather having a single low week, whether that's in the middle of the training block with the distance dropping or at the start of the training block, even because you're starting from too low of a place, can really pull those averages down. So now's when you need to get going. And I think 100 kilometers, that would be my recommendation for you this week, knowing that you want to average about 120. If you can do 100 this week, that means that if you can do your biggest weeks, you can pivot around 120 5 weeks out, right? So your first 5 weeks can be working between 100 kilometers a week this week to 120 kilometers a week in 4/5 weeks time. And then the final 5 weeks of your training block be above 120, working towards 140, and then your 120 becomes the average, right? That assumes you make every day count.
As I will be planning to do. Going to bed earlier, waking up earlier, getting the runs done. Do it again. I think the easy way for me to sprinkle in a bit more distance is if I sneak off for a run, in the evening on 2 or 3 days a week. Like, that's such an easy way of adding another 20 Ks to your week.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. It really is. Right. Do you have any other? I'm not going to bother even asking you this because I know the answer, but I was going to ask you which race you're more proud of. It's going to be Berlin, obviously. Let's instead ask, which race did you feel you learned more from?
I mean, it's always easier to learn lessons where you stuff it up, right? Because you got to take something away. But I mean, I think I've only really run 2 good negative splits in my marathons where I really enjoyed the last 10, 12 Ks. And that was my first marathon and this Berlin race. So in a way, the fact that I've had that experience, I guess, persists stronger with me in that I want that feeling again. Like that half an hour you spend at the back end of the marathon where you're negative splitting and running faster than you were for the first 30 Ks, like there is no better feeling in running. Like that's it. That's the grail. So for me, everything kind of centers around that one feeling. And if I can live that again on the way to a PB, then, I'll keep doing this. If I feel like I can't relive that on the way to a PB, then, I have to look for some other ways to get my kicks out of running.
Yeah, I can understand that. I would say that this Berlin race is a example of a really well performed, well executed race. I mean, there's so much in here that is just top tier stuff, right? Not only did you hold on until kilometer 34 to start putting the effort in, but it looks like actually I think you did overcook it a little bit at kilometer 34. Between kilometer 34 and kilometer 39, I think you went just a little bit too fast, but you didn't put yourself in a hole you couldn't dig yourself out from. So you averaged 3:43 per kilometer for the whole race, and the first half is all above that. It's almost all above that. It's as low as 3:48, 3:50 for some of those Ks. Kilometer 34 comes around, and you go from running 3:40s to 3:30s. You do 3:28, 3:36, 3:31, 3:32, 3:33 between kilometer 34 and 38. That's evidently a bit fast because you then slow down just a little bit in the final 4K, 38, 34, 49, 46, and 44. But the reason that you managed to still keep that negative split and still feel so good about that is because even when you push the pace a little bit, you don't push it by too much. It's just a little bit, and it's happening later in the race. And then you pare it back, evidently a little bit earlier than you did it's only 4 or 5 kilometers that you're going at that speed for. And then you just pare it back just enough, 38, 42, 49. So you don't put yourself in a position that you can't recover from. So there's so many good decisions in this Berlin race, from the speed you set off at to not letting yourself get too excited at halfway. So even when you do begin to get a bit too excited, you keep it restrained enough such that you don't make a bed that you don't want to lie in. It's fantastic. If you can repeat this Berlin race, then you will be making the most of whatever training you manage to do in the next 10 weeks.
Yeah, there's nothing better than going ass to ass down Kurfürstendamm, right? And that's clearly where I got a bit overexcited because you start reeling people in and then you're like, all right, get me to the next person and then the next person. But then I think at some point I realized if I keep chuffing along at that pace, then I'm going to pay for it later. So I think that's where I sort of backed off a little bit.
Yeah, and there kind of is that, like, I know exactly what you mean. There's that a slight downhill. You're coming out of Wilmersdorf, and you're like, it's like a long straight road. The people who have had bad days are starting to suffer, and you're kind of like, yeah, just
Yeah,
steamrolling past.
it's like the down Kurfürstendamm. It's like the haves versus the have-nots. Like you either got it or most people don't got it at that point. Like, and if you've got it, then like the surge of adrenaline is kind of crazy. So
Absolutely. But then that last 4K in Berlin is really tough because you come kind of
Yeah,
past
all the snaking.
it's the closest bit you get to the finish line, and so you're actually going into the finish. So you kind of almost gone past the finish line, and then you're into the heat of the buildings in the city. Anyway, I'm excited to see if you can replicate this. Let's wrap it up there, Michael, and we will be back for analysis of my data next week.
Yep. And but just before we go, I think it's worth doing a little call out to anyone that wants to give some feedback just on our Instagram or on the contact form we have on the website. Please provide the feedback on this format. And if there's people that you want to see their training or want us to dissect their training on here and get them on, just let us know. And they could be anyone, whether a lead athlete, a creator you follow, a regular runner, friend, whoever it might be, someone that's got interesting training and racing that you think we should take a look at.
Absolutely, it would be lovely to meet some new people and look at some interesting data. I do like looking at interesting data.
All right, Josh, thanks for diving into my data. I appreciate it. I feel like I'm better equipped to handle the next couple of months.
Brilliant. Well, let's see if you can do the training. Great to chat,
All right,
Michael. See you next
see you
time.
next time. Bye.